I began to feel as though there was a great advantage in working in a field that people weren't paying attention to. Because I thought, not that I really did think I was going to make a lot of mistakes, but I thought I could make all my mistakes early and have nobody notice it anyhow.
Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. You are a person of great wisdom and strength, and that was author Peter Straub on the benefits of obscurity. While he may have started out in obscurity, Peter Straub ultimately would become anything but that. He's the best-selling author of 17 novels, including Ghost Story, which was made into a movie starring Fred Astaire, and 2 fantasy horror collaborations with his longtime friend and fellow author Stephen King. Those are The Talisman and Black House. His bibliography is extensive, and I won't get into it here, but suffice it to say, he has been a prolific writer for over 40 years and a successful one at that. He started out with dreams of poetry and writing literary fiction. After publishing his first 2 novels and 2 books of poetry, he finally asked himself the question that I think many artists find themselves asking: how do I make a living at this? An agent suggested he try writing a gothic novel, advice that reoriented him for much of the rest of his career, for better and for whatever else. Mostly better, I think he would agree. His natural ability to write novels that, as he says, would be appealing to people who love both Philip Roth and those who love Stephen King, connected with a huge audience that picked up what he was putting down over the course of many years. But before he became a writer in earnest, he was a jazz lover. He discovered jazz as a boy, growing up in Milwaukee in the late 1950s. He gravitated toward Dave Brubeck and Paul Desmond, Clifford Brown, Bill Evans, and Miles. Jazz has been present throughout his life and his career. His friendships with saxophonist Scott Hamilton and trumpeter Warren Vacher deepened his understanding of the jazz life, and I would be remiss if I didn't tell you that he's been a friend to my father, a jazz musician himself, since the two met in a freshman writing course at the University of Wisconsin in the early 1960s. While the hip swinging sounds of his favorite soloists followed him from page to page, there was something else that stayed with him as well: the darker moments of his childhood. A car accident that shaped his first years in school and left him alone and isolated in a body cast and then a wheelchair, just as he was learning to read. He eventually recovered, but the experience turned out to be a kind of catalyst for his writing career. And then there was an even darker secret that he somehow managed to hide from even himself well into adulthood. In our conversation, we explored all of this: the through line of jazz and fiction, improvisation and writing, how the past stays with us into the present, and how watching his Norwegian farmer relatives showed him how to be a diligent writer. Folks, I know I say this a lot, but this one is really special and really extraordinary. I'm lucky that I get to talk to such remarkable people about their journeys, their creative choices, lives, and careers. Normally, I break into the conversations to check in with you, but today I'm just going to let it roll. So before I get started with the conversation, let me do a little housekeeping. You know what I'm going to say. Third-story.com is the place to go for all your Third Story podcast desires and needs. While you're there, you can subscribe to the mailing list and never miss an episode, because I'll send you an email every time a new one goes up. And you can also follow me on Twitter, on the Book of Face, on the gram of Insta, on the tube of you, and on the cloud of sound. While you're there subscribing to all that, you can also poke around and listen to some previous episodes, like the one with Peter's marvelous, talented, and charming daughter, Emma, a best-selling novelist in her own right and a recent bookstore proprietor to boot. Or the one with actor Peter Coyote, or the one with singer Kurt Elling, or the one with saxophonist John Ellis. If you can only choose one, choose the one with John Ellis. And now, without further ado, my conversation with the great Peter Straub. Jazz and writing seem to be the 2 through lines in your life.
They're extremely important. Jazz, in a sense, came first in that I first heard a jazz record when I was, I think, 13. It was a record called Brubeck Time, and it was standards with one original, I think, played in the studio. I didn't understand that record. I bought it because a cousin of mine whom I respect, a girl who's 1 year older than me and just an astonishing person, told me that I would probably like jazz. And because everything she said was pretty true, I thought, I'm going to give that a try. So I went down a crap little store near our house, and I found Brubeck Time. I brought it home, and I knew it was really nice, but I didn't get it. I barely knew human beings were making those sounds. And when they moved into some other realm, it didn't matter if human beings were making it because it was just so great by itself. I listened to that over and over and over. And, once I kind of got it, it was so thrilling. Anyhow, I am never happy just having one of anything. So from that point, I tried to walk into the rest of jazz as it was at the time. And I had a very firm cutoff line of about 1952 that meant anything made before that was boring old-fashioned stuff. And anything played after that was exploratory, interesting, moving, and grown-up. Now, of course, once we got into about 1973 or something like that, what was up to date was Coltrane liberated from any previous definition of music and doing interstellar space or those crazy Japan concerts. They go on and on and on this, or live in Seattle. You ever hear Coltrane's live in Seattle? It's an axe murder. He and Pharoah Sanders are doing nothing but playing overtones and screeching with the rhythm section.
So did you draw another line more or less at
I
1972?
thought, if this is where we're going, I got to go back.
Yeah.
So then I got into Ben Webster, I got into Coleman Hawkins, I really got into Lester Young, and Benny Goodman, and Artie Shaw, then back further to Eddie Condon and Bud Freeman, a whole bunch of trumpet players, Joe Jones, Sid Catlett. What I really loved was like Bill Evans and Paul Desmond and Jim Hall and Miles and Clifford Brown. But once I understood that these guys were not only really not museum pieces, but were just a little bit older than the guys I revered, and we're still working here and there. Then I just went backwards until I got to Bix, and that was where I wanted to stop because I didn't want to really get into Paul Whiteman. I wasn't interested in New Orleans style stuff.
I understand that you were reading, a voracious reader as a young boy.
Yeah.
And it strikes me that the first time you hear or start to understand jazz and understand that these people are speaking a kind of wordless language,
Exactly.
it must have been a revelation to you.
Yeah, it was. That's what moved me so much, especially in my earliest days of paying attention to jazz, was that narrative-like quality that very good musicians had. It made everything sound easy, but it can't be that easy because most musicians don't do it. But the idea of linking phrases together inevitably suggests forward motion, and it helplessly implies a kind of narrative.
Yes.
So then I was on home ground, and I saw it as another version of the kind of thing I was really interested in, except at a better, purer, higher level that could not be translated into words. Part of what was very interesting about jazz to me was that everybody had this sound all their own. And I thought that just came. The first time you took a horn in your mouth and learned to play a couple of scales, I thought you probably sound the way you sounded. And then you worked on your tone. But it was, you could easily tell Ben Webster from Coleman Hawkins from Illinois Jacquet.
Yeah.
But I think those guys worked very hard on their sounds. And younger, since we're talking about tenors, since when I hear most younger tenor players, I don't hear that desire for an individual thumbprint style. There's so much Coltrane, so long after Coltrane's death, that it kind of passed into, it's probably a good thing, this rigorous musicianship and instrumental command, all that stuff is really good. But I'd rather listen to the old Bill Perkins than to Javon Jackson. And he's one of the good ones. He's one of the best ones. So I've been working my way very slowly toward the question of words and fiction.
Yes.
And we haven't got there, but there's no reason why we should get there already.
Well, I would love to get there at any point. Please work your way there.
When I was very small, I was fascinated with print and lettering. I bugged my parents about the names of streets when there's a street sign in the corner. I said, what does that mean? What is that, Daddy? Or cereal boxes or billboards. They had words on them, and the words look like locks to me that, once opened, you could go somewhere good. And so with great frustration, I kept asking my parents to read me things. In the meantime, my father had shown me the drugstore where you could get comic books. And every week or so, he'd go down there and I could buy 2 more comic books and bring them back to the place where we lived. And he read them to me, and my mother read them to me. And they did that so often that I actually had them memorized. And after that, I set up camp on my front stoop, and I invited other kids to come for this interesting thing I was going to do. And then I read aloud from the comic books to them.
So you essentially taught yourself to read.
So I did, and then I really wanted stuff to read, and I was panting to go to school because I knew that's where they did that. Only because I already could do it, a bit in the summer between kindergarten and first grade. When I got kindergarten, was a total disappointment because you never even saw a book at kindergarten. You saw big scissors and construction paper.
And you said, you're holding out on me. I know there's books here.
Where's the book?
Yeah.
I don't want to cut out an elephant. Now, so when first grade came along, I was prepped, and they did pass out books for the purpose of teaching us to read from them. The books, alas, were the Dick and Jane books. Have you ever laid your cunning little eyes on a Dick and Jane book?
I mean, I think I know the plot.
See, Dick, see. Run, run, run. Run, 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 Jane. Run, 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 dog. It made me angry. I felt blocked and really pissed off.
Insulted, it sounds like.
Well, kind of. I mean, it wasn't what I wanted and needed. That's really the truth.
Yeah.
Anyhow, then everything got more complicated because I was bumped up into the second grade, having been vocal about my contempt for our reading matter. And things were better. I didn't know anybody in the class, so it was kind of lonely. But it was okay. I liked having work that challenged me a little bit more. The whole question of fiction is still lying in the background. And then, of course, maybe not of course, but I got hit by this car when I was in the second grade. I spent a year out.
This is not an of course for me. I didn't know that until I started to get ready to talk to you today. And I was really surprised at how much a part of your personal narrative it is. As you know, I recently memorialized our friend Tommy LaPuma.
Sure.
And he also had an accident when he was a young boy. And he came to music by turning the radio on while he was lying in the hospital.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
So what happened to you, Peter, after your accident?
What happened after my accident was a long time in the hospital, which consisted of intermittent but thoroughgoing suffering, during which time I was mainly left alone, of course. Then they let me come home, but after months. But then I was in a body cast that included all of my pelvis. I didn't have a catheter that ran out of that. I don't know what
you did.
I don't know. But when I was a little boy, I looked down at a leg and plaster, an ordinary leg, and the plaster in the middle, and I thought, they took my penis.
Do you remember the accident?
I remember the moment before. What I remember is standing in the middle of the road holding an ice cream cone, having stepped out and walked halfway across without looking. I looked sideways and I saw an old upright grill, that is the grill of an older car, coming right at me. And it was maybe 10 feet away, maybe 20 feet away. And I looked at it and I realized, this is it. I am going to be hit by that thing. And then it moved forward in a series of jump cuts. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a smooth progress. It kind of went frame by frame, only half the frames were missing.
Do you think you had any sense of mortality before that?
No, of course not.
Kids don't have any sense of death.
Kids don't. Kids are and should be in a bubble of innocent narcissism that tells them because they are they, the world is going to be okay. The world's going to turn out all right. All their friends are good people. I love my mommy and my daddy, and I'm pretty good. I'm pretty important.
Mm-hmm.
Because every child knows he is first in the universe unless you get really beat up as a kid.
Do you think you came into contact with mortality at that moment?
I came into mortality, yeah. My brush with mortality was astonishingly premature. But I was still at the age when I was supposed to believe that the world was benign, or at least indifferent. I was going for benign. I thought things were. I mean, we had problems at home, of course, but because my old man was a piece of work. He was a salesman, as in death of. Mm-hmm. But he was also a sort of roistering, slap on the back, extremely grandiose and narcissistic guy. What I'm saying, I guess, is that even though home life could be kind of rocky sometimes, we certainly were never physically abused, not at all. After the accident, I was left alone for much of every day. And I resented it. I was angry. My mother had to go to work. That was the deal. My mother was a nurse, by the way, hospital downtown in Milwaukee. At the time, it struck me as this unbelievable act of betrayal that she would leave me behind and go off to look at a whole bunch of other people. Mm-hmm. And they tried to explain it to me, but it really didn't make sense. And then I also was unhappy and even angry in some buried way about what had befallen me. I didn't think that was supposed to happen to me. Mm-hmm. This was not the plan I had in mind. In one's mind, one exaggerates, at least I do. And so the accident, which did break a whole bunch of bones, and I believe led to a brief near-death experience, so terrifying, that I shoved that way down to the bottom of my unconscious. You know, I had emotions I wasn't allowed to have, really.
And you pushed, this is what you said, you sort of buried all of that.
Yeah, I couldn't bury the daily misery, but I could bury the escape from this world into something finer, higher, way less understandable, in fact, not understandable, something through which I was being pulled and toward which I was being pulled. All that, I couldn't talk about that because I didn't remember. I made myself not remember that. Mm-hmm. Later on, there's another thing I made myself not remember, which astonishes me. I don't know how I did it. And I'm sorry I did it. But I was not a happy boy. However, here enters literature, the stuff that I'd been aiming toward really my whole life, from 1 to 7. And I couldn't move around very much, so we didn't have a television. Or if we did, it was a tiny little dark thing. So I just read. My parents got books from the library, I think. Anyhow, there were a fair number of books. I was in a wheelchair for a good long time. Then I used crutches. All that time, my father is saying, don't favor that leg. Just walk. Don't favor that leg. You don't want to have a limp. So I was thinking, gee, a limp would be really cool. I'd love to have a limp. Look like World War I officers. Anyhow, so eventually I got rid of the crutches, and my father still kept complaining about my gait, till finally, I believe, I practiced this for a long time, and then I could walk in a normal way, even though one of my legs is about that much shorter than the other.
Is it?
Yeah. The one that was operated on is longer than the normal one.
But you were just kind of bossed into losing the limp.
Yeah, I'm glad now.
Yeah. And what about being taken out of school for that?
Well, that's true. I was taken out of school, but that meant that when I came back, I went back to the class I'd been in.
Because you had been advanced.
And so I knew everybody. I liked them a lot as a class. I had tons of friends there.
At that time, do you have any memory of those impulses that would later reveal themselves in you, the macabre, the shadows of the world?
Sure. I mean, I'd become all too familiar with that kind of thing. My parents would not have approved, and to the extent that I let any of that kind of thing out and put it on view, they objected. We lived in America, put it behind you, just get on. You have to live the rest of your life. After all, you're only 7, Peter. That too was frustrating.
But it was sort of tamped down, those impulses in you, seeing the dark side of life.
Well, I wasn't very aware of any of that. But believe me, just in daily life, I had plenty of dark stuff. I had way more than I needed. And it was scary. Any time a door was closed or something terrible behind it, shadows always held hideous things. But even worse was that things like this and this could talk.
An ottoman, a box, a piece of furniture or something.
Yeah, or just might be ready to spring out, you know.
That there was something hiding.
There was something hidden And everything was alive in a very, very sinister sense. Telephones, especially the way they were then, the way they rang, they jiggled very slightly. Everything looked alive and it all looked dangerous. I knew that I could show none of that. I probably complained about it once to my mother, and she probably said, "Don't ever let your father hear you talk like that." What my mother told me that is eternal was that I was about 12. She said she knew that I didn't like most of the people I met, but if I pretended to like them, pretty soon I would. I thought, oh, come on.
And did that?
And I tried it, and of course it worked.
Yes.
It really did. I mean, it did me a powerful amount of good to get down in a sandbox with everybody else.
Yes, exactly. So were you social? Were you a social teenager? Were you a social kid?
I did. Yeah, I was. I had two friends on that first street we lived where I was pre-accident. That I was literally abused in a movie theater about 2 blocks from that house when I was about 5 because I was in the habit of discovering quarters by myself and then going out of the house, walking up the block, walking down a big crowded street and paying my way into a movie theater. They had matinees and things ran all day long, continuous loop. So I go in there, I couldn't buy anything, but I just sat there and watched movies, double features.
Mm-hmm. And you were 5?
Yeah. I mean, what I like were film noir. I like darkness. I like rain on the street. I like street lamps shining, headlights shining on wet streets, guys in raincoats, staircases, blondes who talked out of the side of their mouths, guns. I liked all that stuff. One other reason for liking it, besides the excitement of the theater, is that when I went outside, it was though for a minute or two, I brought all that with me. So all the shadows of the cars on the street were really, really crisp and black. And big lampposts, somebody, there could be something behind that lamppost or something in the windows. It turned that fear that I had before and would have again into a kind of a game and a pleasure because it was an extension of the movie I'd just seen.
But something happened to you while you were there?
On one of my journeys there alone, I cannot remember this except I reconstructed it.
So what you invent in the story is a kind of an imagination of what might have happened?
Yes, I'm sure of that. First of all, the story quickly became of intense importance to me. And it's about a boy going to a movie theater and meeting up with a seedy, presentable creep who eventually is saying, "Hey, I got something for you," And then I know this happened to me. And then I had to go back a couple of times because if I didn't, of course, he'd kill me or kill my parents or whatever those guys say.
Or tell in the story even the fear of telling your parents, which I think is a very believable.
Yeah.
To a child, particularly, the fear of being told on when you don't know what's worse. You know, is it worse to be killed or to be told on? You don't really know when you're 5.
Yeah, you don't. I couldn't have talked about that, and that is the stuff that I made myself forget in the little bedroom we had in that house. I knew I was damaging myself. That I would never be the same after I forgot this thing. And then I went ahead and made myself forget. And then it came back in that story, the juniper tree, which I wrote because it struck me like a bolt of lightning. And when I treated that story with immense respect. And after I'd written it, I put it away. It was written in a bound journal. I put it away on a shelf, and it sat there for about 2 years. And then a friend of mine asked for a story for an anthology, and he told me who else was going to be in. So I rewrote that story and sent it to him, and then it was in this book called Primeval. And then it's been in a few books of mine. That really shook me up and disturbed my world, for sure. And as we have been saying, it could not be spoken about. And when I started to talk about this with a shrink I went to for 30 years, it became clear that something of that sort had really happened. And it made me feel, at that moment in the shrink's office, I remember feeling so filthy and polluted. I thought, anybody who does that to another human being should be slammed in jail right away.
Yes.
Because there's another huge injurious thing that I was incapable of actually getting over. And here's another one.
Yes.
Jump on my back, please.
And yet you have been so fascinated by the minds of the people who do these things.
Yeah, I'm very curious about them. I used to be a lot more curious about them than I am now, because I happen to read books, read more books about them, and see a couple of documentaries on it too, and they're pretty shallow, empty, dopey characters. There isn't a Hannibal Lecter in the bunch.
Mm-hmm. When you get under the hood with Jeffrey Dahmer, it's not as interesting as you would hope.
And Jeffrey Dahmer is one of the best.
And from your hometown.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, I invented Dahmer, but before he appeared on stage, he was fully operational in a novel called The Throat. Anyhow, I got launched in the reading. School libraries were full of material. I mean, for a long time, all I read were Hardy Boys. Then for a long time, all I read were animal stories.
But what you're describing is as you embark on your reading career, on that formation, and I know you say often to people who want to know how to learn how to write that they should read as much as possible.
Yeah.
But as you embark on your reading life, you're starting out with, and this is becoming clear to me right now, with 2 dark secrets at minimum.
Yeah.
That are lying in wait.
Just saying, someday this guy is going to turn 40. And in the meantime, we can fuck him up.
Mm-hmm. That's very revealing in a way, because there's no way to practice to become who we're going to become, right? I mean, it's just kind of there.
No. I did very much want to be a writer. Once I started reading more seriously, because that early stuff I read when I was still lying in bed and unable to move, those books weren't written by human beings, and the illustrations were clearly by some divinity, and they were too good. People couldn't have made that stuff. And I never thought about it in my later grade school years, the things I read. I did know the names of the people who wrote Frog, which was a book about a horse. The books about collies, which were by Albert Payson Terhune.
You're paying attention to the authors. You're realizing there's a person behind these words.
Another thing I did that indicated that was very much alive was my parents had a little bookcase, and the same books were in it every year. I mean, all the time. So, and some of those books looked good. So I pulled down The Stargazer by a Hungarian named Zsolt Hirzani, and I signed it. Best wishes, Zsolt Hirzani, and I put it back. And I did that to half a dozen books.
You signed them on behalf of the author.
Yeah, I did.
You were getting ready to sign books.
It was like when little girls push a baby carriage down a lane.
Yes, that's exactly
I was
right.
practicing. I was kind of held back from really throwing myself into it for a long time. In grade school, I wrote 2 killer diller stories. They were both about as grim as you can get. One is about a spy who, to avoid torture and arrest, jumps through a window very high up in some building. And the story is what goes through his mind on the way down. What chiefly goes through his mind is being a spy was a terrible choice.
Yes.
I should never have been a spy.
You say there was like a realization that there are people writing these things. I've read an interview with you where you said you think fiction is among the great creations of mankind. It's
absolutely. Don't you think? I mean, it's an astonishing thing. And it's never been out of popularity. There's something for everybody in what fiction has to offer. But just in itself, it's an amazing way to deal with one's own experience and human experience in general. And you can, if you represent with accuracy, with real great, or let us sometimes say breathtaking accuracy, then you've done something that really shines on that page. And if you chisel away all the dross that one naturally spills out along with the good stuff, then you've got something that's both unique to you and it can be shared by everybody. And it keeps moving. The way people read shifts, especially now. It must be true. And I know I can't keep up with it. I can read on iPads and on my phone, but I don't much want to.
I want to come back to this, but I don't want to lose the thread of your life, Peter.
No.
And we're about to land in basically where I sort of find you. I mean, not in my own lifetime, but what I sort of first knew about you was that you were in Madison in the 1960s.
Right.
So out of all of this kind of preface, you land in
Madison, yes. A boy who appeared to be normal.
Exactly.
And was, good at school, had a ton of books where I brought my record player and a whole load of records. And I wanted to be what was it I wanted to be? A psychiatrist. And only you had to be a doctor before you became a psychiatrist. So I signed up for pre-med courses, and it was a very bad fit.
Why do you think you wanted to be a psychiatrist?
I love the whole idea. I mean, I like the idea of understanding human motives. I like the idea of listening to people talk.
Yeah. So you invented all of that in the end.
Yeah, I did. And I thought that shrink steak vacation, there are hours between patients, and I thought I could just click up a typewriter from this side of my desk and write a little bit until the next patient. This is what the poet William Carlos Williams did. In between patients, he had a typewriter slid in front of him, and he wrote a couple of poems. So I thought that was doable until I burned my hand like 6 times on a Bunsen burner in chemistry class and realized I had no affinity for it at all. So I went back to my default and I became an English major. I took one creative writing class in my life, and it was that year when I was a freshman. It was pretty crowded for a creative writing class, maybe 25 people, and a terrific professor whose primary passion in life was Saul Bellow. Mm-hmm. It was back in those days, it was 1963 or something. Beyond that, I just kind of threw myself into the work I had to do, and some of which I really, really liked a lot, and into the social life of this one goofball fraternity very close to us, which got later so extreme they were bounced off campus. The house across the street was a real beehive, because your father was there, Sidrun was there, Boz Skaggs was there, and a very nice guy that I discovered your father doesn't remember, a sort of lean, finger-popping African-American guy who had great taste. He was born to be in that building. He loved Horace Silver.
Huh.
So I had long talks with Collis, and he said, "Man, where'd you get all this taste?"
Because you came in digging jazz. You had found that in Milwaukee.
Oh, man. By this time, I had a lot of jazz records.
But that period, it's a very interesting period in the development of the 60s in Madison. Also, 63, you guys were just old enough that you saw it shift under your feet, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
63 was still pretty traditional, right?
It was traditional. When did I graduate? 65. Even in my sophomore year, but certainly by my junior year, there were tables out in public places where you signed some petition. There were protests, but mainly there were guys haranguing from atop boxes. One became very aware that there was a war that was a bad war in which we had no real role. Campus was divided, except 99% was on the side of the liberals. Mm-hmm. Anti-war. I had to live with it, is the way I felt, because what I wanted to do was go in there and read more stuff and write more papers and do kind of what I was supposed to do. I have met guys since who started off at nice colleges like Middlebury. These are black men, and did well, were appreciated on campus, but then discovered that there were all these knockout girls walking around holding signs mm-hmm. and protesting like crazy, and they were just dying to go to bed with handsome black dudes. So that's what this guy Bernard did, and what my other friend Hap did, whose father was a professor at Fisk. And they met girls by going to protests, mm-hmm. So they were out on protests all the time.
Meeting girls was a motivation for so much development over and over and over again. I hear it over and over again.
No, they were also political, I'm very sure. But I think the matter of the draft increased every young man's political awareness.
Yes.
Which, it makes it a little suspect. It was great. I was very glad I wasn't there in 1968. Mm-hmm. But I was there when Kennedy was assassinated. Mm-hmm. I was there when Martin Luther King was assassinated. And the country just seemed appalling. The country had lost its mind. Talk about darkness. very, very shady guy has popped up out of nowhere.
Well, you revisited this idea also
Yeah.
a
Oh,
handful
yeah.
of
In
years
Dark
ago.
Matter.
Yes.
You've done a lot of reading, Leo. Did you actually read all this stuff?
No, I didn't, but
Okay.
I did as much as I could. So just to finish that thought
Oh, yeah.
about these characters who would come through town, these guru guys.
Yeah. They were purely exploitative. Your father met one who borrowed clothes. I think they all borrow clothes.
Yeah.
And they never pay for anything. They kind of charm, and sometimes because they're good looking, they have to be good looking, or at least really interesting. To pull this off, then they invite themselves on your couch, and you say, "Oh, of course, I'm so glad." You can spend the next couple of days, and then they spend a couple of weeks
Mooching.
mooching and dispensing gassy pseudo wisdom. The one on the Dark Matter was very much based on a guy I saw operate once in Madison. A friend of mine on the street said, "You should go to the upper room at 512 Henry," or this is where I lived. But anyhow, a rooming house very near to mine. And he said a guy named Bill Johnson is going to be there. He's amazing. So I thought, okay, I'll try. I go up and here's this guy with rough blonde hair, sort of Steve Bannon as a boy, safari jacket, and a couple of drinks in front of him, wall of girls, and some weedy-looking, highly interested guys, and he just talked and talked and talked about being in Tibet, about seeing blood run down the gutter in a bar, about the Book of the Dead, first time I ever heard of that, about bardos. I mean, he had a whole long, complicated rap, and that was his job. He'd go to these towns, and girls would follow him on. He said, "Okay, you two, come on, please come. Let's continue the party."
The conversation.
Let's continue our conversation. And I never forgot that guy. And he was interested in tarot reading. He was interested in the occult. So I kind of had a beat on him, even though I only saw him that one time. I'm glad I only saw him that one time.
Did you get a sense at that time in your life that you were collecting observations and collecting characters who might be able to make future appearances in your work?
I was still a psychiatrist. Are you kidding? However, even at that time, I had some sort of reputation as a writer, which I cannot explain. I'd been overpraised in high school. I was made a great deal of by English teachers, and I said nobody else made a big deal of me, but my English teachers did, and that was very confirming. And I continued to do well. I dazzled all the other lads and girls in my freshman English course because I could just spout about E.M. Forster and stuff they never heard of.
And you could spout because you had been reading for so long.
Yeah, I've been reading them. I've been reading about those people too. Anyhow, when I was a sophomore, I was with my friend Bob Schuster in the building that I was going to move into in a year. And there was a graduate student present in the room. And he said, "I wish I were like you. I wish I were a writer. You write great." And I'm just, okay, if he says it, I'm going to take it. But he didn't have much evidence. I did, however, act and think as though that was perfectly okay, as though it were my due for this guy to tell me I'm a good writer. Mm-hmm. I don't know what that connected to in the world of actual accomplishment, because it didn't. But what it did acknowledge was desire in me that, the part of me that really did want to write, and I think really actually defined myself as a person who wrote first.
Before you wrote, you defined yourself as a person who wrote.
As a potential writer, a writer who could be potentiated, who would then be able to work. I said to that guy that I'd always been afraid to start because I knew that once I started, I wouldn't want to do anything else.
Which is true.
Well, I certainly didn't want to do anything else, I'll tell you that.
But by the time you graduated, you came to Columbia for a year?
Yeah. That was all English lit. Yeah. English lit. Ann Lauterbach, whom I met there, who's like a genius. And was a genius then, but a genius of self-absorption. Nobody ever spoke about themselves and their problems as lyrically and movingly as that young woman did. It was fabulous. I fell in love with her. And besides that, she was astonishingly beautiful. She was so beautiful. Once this was in Dublin later, we were walking down a big street in Dublin, a carriageway, and a truck driver came up, a guy in a huge truck, came barreling up the straightaway thing. And he turned his head and he looked and he saw Anne, and he put his brakes on because he wanted to look at her a little more.
You saw it happen.
I saw it happen.
Do you think that, I mean, as much of a product of the 60s and particularly Madison at that time, there was something always a little more traditional, a little more formal about your approach? You were always like pretty sharp dressed, right?
Yeah.
Classic, and attracted to, you mentioned being in Dublin, like you were attracted to the UK, you were attracted to England, you were attracted to
It all seems very old-fashioned now, but that's where I thought all the action was. I cherished the notion that I could one day write fiction, and I was almost positive that one day I could. And that lasted until we got to Dublin, where I felt that if I didn't start writing a novel then, I might lose it. So instead of writing the boring thesis I was supposed to be doing, I went to the same place, the National Library, a big, gloomy, beautiful place with ancient guys who searched down the files for you, the books, the papers. You had to sign in this massive ledger by hand.
Wow.
I went there every day, so pretty soon I was making up names.
And instead of writing your dissertation...
Instead of trying to read stuff about Trollope or Thackeray, I tried to write 500 words a day of a novel, following the advice of Graham Greene, who pointed out that if you wrote 500 words a day at the end of the year, you'd have a novel. So I did that without much planning. I enjoyed it a lot. It did feel like being seated on the right saddle, finally, like walking into a house and thinking, oh yes, this is the house I've been looking for.
And did that in fact become your first novel?
Yeah, it was called Marriages. It wasn't very good. It was nicely written. It got some good reviews and some bad ones. It didn't sell for shit, but I did get it published, which is quite a feat, actually.
Did you have any idea how one wrote a novel before you started writing the novel?
Well, I'd read a lot of novels. In Dublin, I had my version of a creative writing course with a friend of mine named Thomas Tessier. We didn't know each other before we met in Dublin. We met at a poetry reading or at a pub where there were poetry readings. Later, we did poetry readings together because, as I've forgotten until the second, all this time from age like 20 to into now, I was deeply into poetry. I read fiction, but I read a ton of poetry. I had a lot of people I liked, other people I disliked. It was a lively world, especially in Dublin, where there are poets all over the place, and poetry readings all over the place all the time. And so Tessier and I did a lot of readings. I published there, and he published there.
I heard you once refer to that period as your own little Iowa.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it was. Tessier and I swapped a lot of manuscripts, and we recommended books to each other. There wasn't anything faintly studious about this at all.
But you were kind of teaching one another how to do it.
Yeah, and ourselves, mainly. It is helpful to have a sounding board. And someone who likes basically the same stuff you do,
Right, exactly. Gets you.
Yeah, that's right. I kind of had a notion that writing books would be, a really splendid thing to be doing. I knew it would call upon a lot of whatever I happen to have inside me, and it just seemed extremely attractive. And also, I didn't have any other destiny that I could visualize except really crappy ones.
Like what?
Oh, like lying in the gutter, like being in jail, like being a total fraud. Marrying the really wrong woman and being trapped, of becoming a criminal. I don't know.
Those were the roads not taken. It was
I'd be a very lousy criminal. I hate to confess, but I would be. Although I was still writing poetry, and in fact, I had 2 books published.
Of poetry early? Of
poetry, when we lived there. One in 1972, one in 1973. I didn't want to try to make a kind of life on the money a poet would be likely to earn. And by that point, I didn't really want to do anything else unless I could teach the kind of stuff I was reading in that library.
Did you have ambition? Did you have ambition to be a successful writer?
I'm not sure. The first novel was an imitation of John Updike Scott Fitzgerald and somebody else. I hadn't yet tried to get Saul Bellow into my books. The next time around I did. Once I started writing actual fiction, I wrote that novel, then I wrote like 20 stories one summer. So I was ripe. After that, it was unthinkable to go back to writing a thesis. So I just I bet the farm. I doubled down. I sent this book off to an English editor. I didn't even have an agent. I don't know how I heard about it. I just sent it to the publisher. I didn't know her. I didn't know the woman who bought the book. I didn't know anybody there except a guy named Andre Deutsch, who ran the company and whose publishing company was the same as his name. So at Deutscher is this woman who read my book in a slush pile and liked it and arranged for it to be published. She liked what I did, and I loved her, of course. And it seemed to me that that was all I needed to face the obstacle that had been present all along, and which I have not spoken of until this very second, which is that my parents would have thought the ambition to write fiction either insane or perverse. It would have angered my father because it would seem like throwing away money and deliberately electing to have a low rent, wasted, impoverished life, as he would have seen it, an impoverished life riddled with delusion. If I'd told them, my parents and Susie's parents, if I told them that I chucked my studies and I was writing a novel, some of those people would have flown to Dublin and handcuffed me to the table.
Flown you back with them.
So I didn't tell them until I had a novel that was going to be published. And then at last I could say, look at this. This is what I want to do. I can make enough money year by year if I write one of these for us to survive and do reasonably well, especially in Dublin where nobody had any money at all. And then after that, I began to write on a daily basis. And
so that's the moment that you began writing as a job.
Yeah, it started in Dublin in the National Library, but that really was a kind of experiment. I gave myself 3 tries, and I didn't tell Susie that. If I wrote 3 manuscripts and none of them were publishable, I'd stop trying to do that, and I'd go look for a job. So
but you wrote one and it was published.
I wrote one and it was published, so I squeaked in well before the deadline.
For the better part of your career,
yeah,
you have woken up, gone to work.
Pretty much.
And set these targets for yourself.
Yeah.
You know, I always wondered, like, where does that come from? Where did that ethic come from? And also, just where does one decide this is the target? This is what I do.
Well, that part's easy. But the only reason I could do that and work with great application every day for decades was that my mother's parents were farmers. And we would go up to this farm every summer, and I'd see how those guys worked. It was all day long. So when I'm sitting at a desk with a bound journal in front of me or a computer screen, but way back at the beginning, I mean, I was thinking of those people who weren't very verbal and spoke Norwegian when they were in Wisconsin, that something of their attitude had flowed into me. I hate being late. I hate being really disorderly. I don't like that. There are certain traits that I have directly from these Norwegian farmers. And I have to say that inheritance did me a power of good. Because I'm also, my mother never stopped wishing to inform me, I was also lazy. And so if I stopped, then I could open up a book and flop down and read a book for a couple hours. I also had ways to do that.
Sure.
So you read 50 pages an hour. That means a 200-page book you read in an afternoon.
Yeah.
I can't do that anymore. I barely want to.
Yeah.
Except I'd love to read in the immediate way that I did when I was in my 20s. You know, really just total immersion. All of that was great preparation. It's like muscle memory almost. You learn how to pace things.
Yeah.
Where big events are supposed to occur. And you also figure out that there are all these details that swim around in the book, that light here and light there, names for colors, references to baseball players, whatever, description of a house. These things go in and out, and they tie the book all together. And at some point, the surprise in the book or the revelation emerges from all these things that were floating around. And you get a great feeling when you read that.
Yes.
Now, I had that great feeling so often that I began to be suspect of it. You know, I've worked for a long time on the model of the traditional narrative. I wasn't working on the model of horror stories, though at the beginning, that was a label I was very happy to have. I knew how people felt about it, and I didn't care.
About horror.
Yeah.
You describe it in your biography as being offered an opportunity or the suggestion to write a gothic novel.
Yeah, that's what my agent said. I didn't really know what that was. It turned out that that is what I write, in a way. Gothic novels or novels of sensation. But they take so long, and one spends so much care on them, and there's so much invention, so much feeling, that it seems like an object at the end that can be read by somebody who loves Philip Roth and somebody who loves Stephen King.
Yes.
That was where I wanted to pitch my tent, only nobody wanted that tent. I mean, they loved my work. For a long time, people ate up my work like crazy. It's the very work that came out of these long sessions, sometimes before breakfast, all morning, soap opera in the afternoon, nap, then back to work, then dinner, then back to work.
So that was the routine.
Yeah.
Wake up and work.
Wake up and work, breakfast, conversation with wife and cutie pies, and back to work. There's a newspaper and there's some television here, but it was just after breakfast. There's work until about 2:00. Then you have lunch and watch your soap opera. I did One Life to Live, and then you just refreshed. You go back to work until you drop. Certain unwise substances are very useful in such a practice.
When the agent suggested that you write a Gothic novel, after having written some work that was well received, but hadn't really connected.
I said, what can I do to earn some money?
Yes.
I don't want a job. I want to make a living writing. What do you, and she was the magazine girl, I said, in the agency that I finally found after I found a publisher for marriages.
When you first approached writing a Gothic novel or a horror novel, did you have a sense of what that would mean? And did it feel comfortable to you when you started doing it?
It felt astonishingly comfortable for me, for reasons that you can extrapolate. I walked into that water because I wanted to be able to earn a living. There weren't very many actual horror novels that were any good that were that had been published. There was The Exorcist by Thomas Blatty, or his name was. And there was The Other by Thomas Tryon. And Shirley Jackson was just about dead, I think. But she had written, it isn't Hill House, The Haunting of Hill House. It's a fabulous book. And a great movie by Robert Wise called The Haunting. I didn't know of the substrata of busy but not brilliant young and middle-aged and old horror writers, all writing in amateur magazines and little journals they printed by themselves and anthologies they printed. I'd never heard of any of those people. So I thought this avenue was wide open, and I'm either going to write a crime novel to try to make some money and save my life, or I'm going to write one of these horror novels. And I talked about it with various people, and it seemed to me the horror novel was a really better thing to write because Henry James had written The Turn of the Screw. I thought, that's all the justification I need. And I liked some of the work that Tom Tessier had asked me to read. It wasn't my thing, but I liked it. That is, those stories were by people like Richard Matheson and Robert Bloch, and they were like episodes of The Twilight Zone. They all had a little twist at the end, and everything was organized very beautifully and with astonishing efficiency to move to that end while keeping you from seeing that it's coming. It's nice. It's a nice model, but it's not for me. So I started a detective novel, I think a little later, and it was comic because the identity of the villain was clear, unlike page 3. And so it seemed to me I wasn't doing the job in the right way, so I gave it up. What I felt when I wrote the first sentence of the novel called Julia is that my first emotion was surprise, because even though I thought there was some danger of writing down and dumbing up the way I wrote, which I thought would be a fatal move, because I thought once you damaged whatever the intricate little machinery is, it would never work right in the old way ever again. So I didn't want to put Coca-Cola in my gas line.
So you didn't, though?
No, I didn't. When people heard, and now when people hear the word horror, they clam up and they're not interested. They turn their backs and they walk away. It happened to me the first time I was talking. After the first book, I was in a barbecue in the back of a house in North London, and a nice English guy in a pinstriped shirt came up to me and said, and inquired about my state and condition, what I did, and who I was. And I was a friend of the people in the building, and I'm a writer. What kind of writer? Novelist. Oh, what kind of novels? Horror novels. I never saw the guy again. I barely saw him then. He just whoosh. Okay, hey, I'm in the gutter. I began to feel as though there was a great advantage in working in a field that people weren't paying attention to. Because I thought, not that I really did think I was going to make a lot of mistakes, but I thought I could make all my mistakes early and have nobody notice it. Anyhow, those books turned out to be pretty good. Julia, and If You Could See Me Now. They sold to paperbacks, to paperback companies. And the paperbacks did way better than anybody had imagined they would, because that whole stream of stuff was just about to come in. The movie The Exorcist, I don't think had been released at that point. I don't think. I remember seeing it in downtown London and being astonished by it. But anyhow, my ambitions changed after a while. I was very happy to be called a horror writer.
After the success of the paperbacks.
Yeah, well, even before, because I didn't know there was a stigma. I learned there was a stigma eventually, and I sort of chafed under it. But I always thought, in the most egotistical manner possible, that if I just kept doing good work, people were going to notice. Some people are going to notice eventually. They're going to notice that books by author X are rather different from books by author A. You know, it just I was hoping for smart readers who would step over what they saw as a barrier and discover my work, because I thought there was something there to like. Anyhow, I was very, very comfortable with the content and subject matter, because all that stuff was way too much in my head anyhow.
Well, yeah.
It was rampant.
Were you aware of it, of how rampant it was?
Not really. It would make sense for me to try to tell you about the stages of writing I went through.
Yes.
And the accommodations I made. I was very happy being called a horror writer. And when I was back in America, I went to a couple of conventions, and I discovered there was this whole world, and I had like colleagues almost. Mm-hmm. And
you had peers.
I had peers, except, of course, none of those people made any money at all. Mm. And after my second supernatural novel, If You Could See Me Now, had sold to Coward McCann, my publisher, and to Pocketbooks for the sum of like $30,000, of which half was mine. So I got like $10,000 for the book and $20,000 for the paperback, and that's the money I made, because royalty statements are generally a joke. Publishers will steal whatever they can.
Like the record business.
Yeah, exactly. So I went to lunch with my agent, and I said, now, okay, twice in a row, I've gotten like $5,000 to $10,000 advances for hardbacks, $40,000, $45,000, $50,000 paperback deals that I have split with you. And what I want to know is, how do I get from the $30,000 paperback advance to the $300,000 paperback advance? And unfortunately, he said, I don't know. So he was a great guy, but I sort of lost faith in him at that moment. But then, having written those two books and having faced the usual insecurity that new writers face, that is it all a fluke? Is this business of creation illusory? Anyhow, you know.
And that's only something that new writers face? You, at a certain point, you outgrow that?
You outgrow that version of it. And I mean, I performed well, my books performed well after a little while, so that worry vanished. I knew it wasn't a fluke. I knew it was something ingrained, and that practically could not be erased, but could be damaged.
But what did you then do in order to jump and connect?
What I did Well, it was like, I hate to use this word, but it was like a purely organic process. While doing those two books, I had learned that you can cover a lot of emotional ground and get a lot of resonance out of stories in which the identities are mixed and confused, in which things rise up out of rooms or forests, and there are threats, there are betrayals, letters, lost letters,
Wait, these are specific kinds of ideas, images that you
Yeah.
felt resonated, that
Yeah,
people.
and my books were full of those things. They emerged at the moment they were supposed to emerge on the page, so I was pretty confident. But I was dissatisfied with the amount of money I was making, because by then we'd moved to London because of the agent I had, and because of the publisher who bought my book there.
So you're living in London and your overhead is higher.
Yeah, that's right. It's not as expensive as it is now, and we could live on the amount of money I made, but it was pretty hand to mouth. I loved bohemian poverty for a while.
Yes.
Because it means you're liberated. You don't have to go off and do what all those other guys do, and you get to hang out and have coffee with your friends and work your own hours. You're your own boss and your own competition, really.
Yes. But you're also your own
had-
competition once you have success, because
Yeah.
you have to beat that success or meet it again.
That's right, pretty much. So I thought up an idea that was more muscular. Also, in the meantime, I had met Stephen King, and we'd gotten on, and I'd read Salem's Lot, which I just loved, which knocked me out. There was not another novel like that in sight. There's no indication that it's a vampire novel until the vampire shows up, and he's just an old guy standing at the dump, and our hero Ben Mears doesn't know who he is, but he can't even see his face, because I think the guy's turned away toward the dump. And just something the way the figure is described, you say, holy shit, he's a vampire.
Yeah.
This is a vampire novel. I mean, I thought that was so brave, because vampires then were cornball.
Yeah.
They were really, nobody would have seen them as romantic figures. What I wanted to do, and this changed my life for sure, was honor and build on the shoulders of, in some way to exploit, great American writers who had swum in this particular pond. I invented most of the characters, and I thought about the town, and I had initial matters kind of worked out, so it looked like it might work. And it was going to involve these four guys who told stories to each other, and the stories they were going to tell were classic American supernatural stories or fantasy stories that were based on actual stories. So Sears James told a story about being hired as a teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in upstate New York, and that story was based on the turn of the screw. It was unfortunately a lot longer than I had intended it to be. And the next one, told by a man named Ricky Hawthorne, was a version of the Hawthorne story, My Kinsman Major Molyneux. And by that point, I was in the middle of the beginning, and I'd written like 150 pages. I realized I couldn't include the second two stories, so I proceeded on from there. But so doing that book was a very happy experience. I believe I learned that I had learned a lot.
And while you were writing it, did you have a sense, a feeling, this is a little different, something is different here?
I knew it was much bigger, and I knew it was better. In any case, it was stronger than anything I'd done, because I'd done very little before. I'd done two novels. Well, I'd done four. One never published. Marriage was not very good. Then these two that were published. There was a party that Jonathan Cape, the publisher of Ghost Story, had for Christmas. They had it every year. I went once when before Ghost Story was published, but they all liked me, so they invited me. And I met Ian McEwan there, who was a really cool guy, I thought. And at that Christmas party, an executive of Jonathan Cape came up to me and he said, we always think that it's going to happen with the fifth book. And I said, what? And he said, a breakthrough. Your breakthrough is this book for sure, and that's only your fourth. So, but we always think it's going to be fifth. I invite you to consider the patience that publishers used to have.
This is exactly where the mind goes, right? I mean, do you think that publishers could possibly be thinking in the same terms today?
Not at all. They want to, as one says, monetize the books as soon as possible.
Yes.
And if you make enough money, you're welcome back. And if you're not, you're going to have to eat, you know what, for a while.
Yes.
Or not get published. Hence, there's a very, very flourishing small press scene.
Does a young, developing Peter Straub in the 21st century find a way to connect with his readers the way you did at the end of the 20th century?
It's possible, maybe. Look at that young writer, Emma Straub. She certainly connected with a lot of readers.
Her trajectory is in some ways similar, but in many ways very different from yours. Mm-hmm. She, first of all, had the advantage of knowing what it means to be a writer.
Yeah. And she also had a father who wasn't going to flip out or freak out when he learned that's what she wanted to do. In fact, I of course, supported her intensely.
But she also is the product of something else that I want to talk to you about a little bit, which is an MFA program.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay, yeah, let's.
Because it strikes me that you are a product of the old school.
Yes.
And this, in some ways, connects with the question of jazz as well. In that you found a way to find a voice and find a style and develop technique over time.
Yeah.
And pretty much invented out of, in the case of many musicians, having listened to what came before. In your case, having read what came before.
Yeah.
I've heard the story of you and Emma collaborating on a short story in which at one point she says, well, Peter just doesn't know how to write a short story.
She said, at least I know how to write a damn short story. To her mother. But because I kept doing what I was doing, I kept trying to shove in all sorts of cool other stuff. I gave a whole bunch of names to different characters that are the main characters meet. And Emma just ruthlessly whipped all that stuff out every single time. And I thought, okay, I evidently wanted a 100-page story.
Right.
And Emma wanted a 20-page story.
No, I've heard you say it's one day maybe we'll sit down and finish what is waiting to be finished.
I'm not sure I could do it now, but it'd be nice. It's a nice story, and there's enough unresolved and mysterious in it to give us all the room we need.
You look at an example like Emma and say, okay, there is a way for a young writer to connect today.
Yeah.
But
it's like a miracle.
But the business is quite different.
It is. It's grimmer and more frightened. They were all panicking about ebooks. They wanted very much to get in the ebook business. And then when they did, and people started going there and buying ebooks, they noticed that they were making a hell of a lot less money, like half. And the authors also noticed that they were making about half the money than previous. And because of that, there were firings all over the book industry. People would go to work and be the only person in the office in their line, walk past the art department where there used to be 4 or 5 people who did good work. No more,
It's the same story in the music business. But similarly, there is now a way to study jazz that there wasn't.
I know there is.
I was thinking about everyone you described. You start with Paul Desmond, that sweet sound, that elegance, that refined thing.
But he was way more than that. Way more than that. He was when the wind was up and he felt like blowing, he could really blow.
Yeah.
And he was also astonishingly expressive. He could do a lot with that horn. And he was a brilliant improviser of melodies. Sometimes I listen to him now and I hear one long, perfectly developed melody come out. Sometimes there's a little counterpoint with himself and then it moves on. He very rarely breaks down and just does scale stuff,
Do you relate as a writer to those? Is there any part of you as a writer of narrative that aspires to write like a great solo?
I wish, yeah, of course. When I was in high school, I tried to do that a couple times. But I tried to write a story in which every note in a certain Desmond solo would be a word in mine, and the story would move the way the solo moved. But I could never do it.
But even in the way that you wrote, my understanding was for most of your career you wrote longhand. You might have a certain outline, which I think of as, in a way as like the changes to a song.
Yeah.
And within that you're kind of riffing.
Yeah, that's the point really. So you have something to fall back on. But a lot of times I worked without a safety net, as it were. And sometimes that's the best stuff. When I discovered in the second great turning in my career, the first was a ghost story, in which suddenly I actually did make money. So much so we had to leave England, and we moved to Westport, Connecticut.
So what was the next turning point?
With Ghost Story, my financial life was made much more comfortable for far longer than I would ever have anticipated. And I was doing really well with all the books I wrote after that. So I was a hot property. I took a year off after writing a book called Floating Dragon, and the first book was Steve King, The Talisman. That was like 3 years, just no breaks. And so I announced to my wife I was going to take a year off, and I did take that year off. I did some good things, some bad things, some smart things, some stupid things, and I spent a lot of time in the summer sitting on my front lawn reading a book and drinking beer. It didn't bother me, man. And then became time to start again, and I knew it was time to start because I was really turned on by something I had read in a book called The Freudian Fallacy. I can't remember who wrote it. That guy, who was an MD and a neurologist, told me what happens in hypnotism in one's brain, the sort of waves made, the sort of chemistry that happens, is very similar or identical to what happens when people have epileptic fits. So I thought, okay, let me cross those wires. So, of course, it's silly. You cannot, no matter how good a hypnotist you are, you can't convince somebody they should swallow their tongue. But anyhow, that's what I did.
That particular story, which...
Blue Rose.
When I read that, I thought, in order to think of this, you have to be in touch with a part of life that many of us are just not in touch with. I hear you now saying, okay, this was quite deliberate. Sometimes you write without a net, although in this particular case, you knew you were going to walk into a situation in which epilepsy and hypnotism are...
And the guy was going to kill his little brother. That was the story I wrote after taking at least a year off, and it was very, very hard to write.
Why?
Because I lost my chops. I mean, I don't think that could happen now. I don't think it did happen, in fact, but I took too much time off, and I kind of forgot how I had done things. So I love that story very, very intensely because it brought me back into my own workshop, into my own powers. I was very, very pleased with it because also that gave me entry to Coco. And I wanted Coco to be different from anything else I had written. I wanted it to be more serious. I had gone way overboard deliberately with Floating Dragon, which is a crazy Technicolor, surround sound horror movie. It's got a lot of good stuff in it besides that, I assure you. But my whole point was to blast my way out of the horror world by throwing everything I could think of in the same book. And it went well. Everybody loved it. I mean, a lot of people. The only people who didn't love it were horror fans. And I never understood that. The people for whom I actually wrote it didn't like it at all.
Well, proving that you should never do anything to satisfy your audience because they'll betray you at every turn.
Yeah, that's right.
You wrote that you were prone to nightmares after your accident, and they were finally settled by writing horror.
Pretty much, they were. For a long time, I was going to say decades, and it probably is decades. And when I kind of moved off that particular base and toward another part of the field, the nightmares came back. Only by that time, I was seeing a shrink, and a nightmare to a shrink is like a steak to a dog. It's juicy. And that woman helped me see why I had written this crazy Floating Dragon, why I was so at home with fear. She saw a lot in me. She saw into me in a way that maybe my mother had, but I don't think anybody else ever did, and that I didn't want to know about. I didn't want that history to be me. I didn't want to be objectified.
But that's what's so astounding is that as a writer, you are able to see into the past and the psyches of all of your own creations. As,
I hope.
Without having to see into yourself necessarily.
Yeah. Well, in those first 3 books, yeah, and the Talisman too, probably, because the Talisman was not supposed to be inward at all. It's just a mighty nice romp.
Your life has been so marked by your work, by waking up and writing and working.
Yeah, that's right.
In recent years, it has been harder for you to write.
It's been harder. That's right. I was slowing down a bit anyhow. My pace through most of my life was a book every 18 months. That was comfortable. I was writing books that were of ordinary novel length and writing pretty much without impediment or problem. It wasn't difficult for me to keep doing it that way. That was true during Ghost Story. I wrote like 10 pages a day. Shadowland was the book after that, which was even more imaginative, I think, and I like that book a lot. That was all kind of working off a horror model, though the model got more and more porous and expansive as I went along. I was a guest of honor at a World Fantasy Convention in the mid-'80s, or earlier mid-'80s, and I was supposed to get after dinner, after banquet speech, and I said, horror is a house that horror has already moved out of. And some of those people didn't like that at all, because they were happy having their little patch of land, haunted dogs, haunted rabbits, imitation Lovecraft, imitation Stephen King. They didn't want to think about it the way I did. But I did want to expand things, and it seemed to me that in Shadowland, certainly, I had expanded it beyond recognition. But if anybody asked, they would probably say it's a horror novel because of the kind of atmosphere it has, and because, after all, a boy is crucified inside a room, and another boy is turned into a glass bird. The arch villain, master magician, is killed. There's a girl who turns out to be a robotic version of the Little Mermaid, the one who develops legs and feet,
yes,
and can't take a step on ground without
So
it.
are all of these ideas, do these surprise you as you're writing them? Do they emerge out of you on...
Sometimes.
They speak through you.
Yeah, but mainly it's like transmission. Something is coming from somewhere. And as long as you keep your egotism at bay and avoid intoxicants, to
Yes.
a great deal,
Yes.
if you can get through kind of undamaged, it will be damaged because it's going through a human vessel.
Inspiration is real but earned.
Yeah.
You said at one point. It comes, but you have to be working for it to arrive.
You have to be in the right place. You have to be ready. I really did learn that. I had very beautiful, exciting moments of inspiration, but mainly the kind of inspiration I was talking about was just the feeling of being able to sit down and pick up a manuscript, a narrative that you set down yesterday and make things up in a logical, articulate, developing manner. If you're at that stage and if you're in the right shape, it happens fast. I mean, you don't have to revise much, and wonderful information and ideas kind of flow through.
I mean, I've known you my whole life as a very easygoing, happy, ready to groove and talk about some jazz guy.
Yeah.
And I realized that in all those times that throughout my life that I've interacted with you, or for the majority of them, just behind the scrim is a totally interior monologue that's taking place that's being paused while we have our conversation and have our meal and enjoy
Is that what you think?
Well, this is what I wonder.
I think many people think that.
When you put the pen down, does that noise go away?
Pretty much, if it's about fiction, but of course something else comes in and replaces it right away. I do think of the work I'm not doing when I get out of bed, when I take a shower, and everything I think of in those moments is really good. It emerges fresh from the other world.
Yes.
Or my subconscious has had a little while to rest and it coughed up a goodie.
So you feel like you've missed plenty of great things in the shower and in the real world?
Well, and sometimes I remember them long enough to write them down, but very often I think, that's so good, I'll never forget that.
Of course.
That idea is perfect for the book, and as soon as I get my clothes out, I'm going to write it down. But Coco was a second shift in my work, if that's interesting, because I wanted to take it seriously. I wanted to use all the raw, despairing, frantic, terrified, evil, or violent impulse that had been cooking away at me, and use it in human terms. To not make monsters, not have dead people come out of graves, not have a flood of red spiders come out of a policeman's ass, which I did once. I'd had enough. Horror was a house that horror had moved out of, and I was ready to move out too, in the direction that I wanted to go. So I cooked up this big thriller-ish idea, because an idea happened to me as I walked across my front lawn in Westport once, which is 4 members of an old platoon go back to Asia to search for a 5th member who might have gone off the rails and is killing people. I go, okay, sounds a little movie of the week, but let's try. It's the only idea I had. And when I got into that, I knew I was operating at a very, very good depth. And the stuff that came to me was worthy, you know. It felt like real people. I did learn something very, very valuable during the writing of Coco, because I'd taken the year off and only written Blue Rose. I wasn't fully tuned up. And I wrote the first paragraph of Coco, or the first page, and I looked at it and I saw it was terrible. The writing was awful. So my heart folded in half and my stomach froze. And I thought, holy, is that what I'm doing now? This kind of garbage. So then I worked out what I had to do to improve that page so it would look like my work again.
Yes.
And after that point, I revised everything immensely. All my pages looked like wiring diagrams that I was done, because I understood how to put things in order so the reader wouldn't have to stop and say, wait, no, did that happen before that? Or I learned you put the cause before the effect.
And you think taking that year off and then seeing your work with fresh eyes allowed you to recognize that the process of revision was an important one?
Yeah. I think the work I did before that, i.e. primarily Ghost and Shadowland, are written pretty well. But if I were to be given a pencil and told to revise them, there's a lot I could do, I think. It was a desperate and rather unhappy discovery, but as time went by, I liked it. I loved the idea of improving what I had done and making it much, much better. And I also learned that process is more or less eternal. That until you give it up, you're still going through it and making little changes.
It's not finished until you have to deliver
until they take it away.
Yes.
And then they stole your baby.
Yes.
You know, it's a terrible moment. So I did those Blue Rose books that it wasn't planned that way. It didn't occur to me that I could do it until the end one, the throat, because I wanted to use that character, Tim Underhill, again. I don't really see how the work I did then, Coco, Mystery in the Throat, and the couple of books that followed it, can be thought of as purely genre. I mean, they were written as fiction. Everything I wrote was written as fiction. But these especially, and they were supposed to be, and they did, take the impulses toward the supernatural and just put them in people's minds.
Let's talk about jazz. The dedication of your selected stories clearly makes a point of naming some of the most
musicians,
influential relationships in your life, and many of them are musicians.
Yeah, that's right. I loved what musicians do. I still do, and I love the musicians themselves. Now I can see their shortcomings perhaps a little more, but they're not all in divine beings in human form. I like the idea of expression being the first thing in your life. Guys who carry their horns around, guys who really only seem most alive when they're working. I never understood the difference or the way the performance angle is sorted out from the art angle, you know, because people in the audience can hear 6 musicians, a little jazz band on stage. Everybody solos, the drummer solos, and when the concert's over, the people are all saying, "Oh, I'm so glad we came tonight."
Yeah.
They were inspired. And backstage, they're all bitching.
Yeah.
And most of them think they played like shit.
They do.
And they did, actually. If they feel that way, you know, it turns into a nightclub act.
Yeah.
And they do what they're expected to do. And it's just like being Trummy Young with Louis Armstrong.
Yes.
You don't have much room. Or that guy used to play with Louis Jordan.
And at the same time, you know, cats could be playing essentially the same changes their whole life.
They can.
And find a way to stay present and new and fresh with it.
Absolutely. And I love those people. I love the people who speak in connected phrases. I like intricate chord changes. I like extended melodies.
In some ways, you ended up happily for most of your middle age, your adult life, living very close to a scene that sort of developed, the uptown scene, the scene up at Smoke.
That was nice, yeah. I wish I'd known about it earlier, but that became my favorite club, and I liked the musicians who played there a lot. When I had a car and I used to drive on BGO, there were two tenor players I used to hear that I could never identify, but I knew they were exactly the kind of tenor players I most liked. Like Lester, Zoot, Scott Hamilton, they were Gene Ammons and Eric Alexander. They're not much alike.
Not at all.
But boy, I mean, those cats can play, Gene Ammons didn't have to do 16th notes.
No,
but he could lay it down, man.
Or 16 choruses, man. He would do it he said it in a few short choruses.
Yeah.
But he was a guy who you hear him immediately.
Yeah.
And that's Gene Ammons.
Yeah. I hadn't heard enough of him. I thought of him as that guy that you had to listen to Sonny Stitt.
Yeah. Yeah.
I do feel it. Jazz informed my life, and it helped save my life. My own work saved my life without any doubt. Because if I had turned into a shoplifter who had to sleep in the gutter, I wouldn't see much point to staying alive, I don't think. I like the knowingness of jazz musicians. I like the inwardness of the world they were in, the way they all talked about each other all the time, and sometimes other things. But a lot of it was jazz-centric. It was all jazz-centric. After I became pretty tight with Scott and Warren, then I began to see a lot more. And they spoke very, very frankly. In fact, they all did.
That's an interesting thing, that part of what was kind of compelling was the world, the insular world, the sort of navel-gazing world of the jazz musicians.
I like that.
And that you, if you're hip and you can hang and you can talk, you can hear it and you know what they've played and you know where they're coming from, that you can be a member of that club.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't have much resistance at first because I was actually famous. And I did have a lot of money. Yeah. And while that's not a turn on, really, it does, in some mysterious way, give you access.
Interesting.
If you're introduced by the right person.
Yes.
And then the way I talked, I met Scott and Warren at the same time in front of a gig at the Pizza Express.
Oh, London.
Right before that, yeah. It was 1978. And Scott and Warren and I got on with both Scott and Warren, so they were equal friends right from the beginning, which was useful because then they ceased to be friendly with themselves. And who could blame them? They were just put together on the same stage over and over and over. And Scott, I think, inwardly rebelled at having to share everything for so long. But Warren, I think, was a beautiful, beautiful player, and he still is a beautiful player. He was so brave. It was so melodic and so rich and so bold, too. Warren sometimes knocked the chandeliers off the ceilings.
Peter Straub, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Leo D.
There it was, the great Peter Straub. What a moving talk. I'll be back soon with another great conversation. Until then, I'll talk to you soon.